Commander Kira Vance's transport touched down on Thelkar Prime, expecting recriminations. 5 years ago, she'd walked out of a wedding ceremony that was supposed to cement the alliance between humanity and the Volcari sovereignty, leaving crowned sovereign Thulmora standing alone before thousands of witnesses. The political fallout had been catastrophic. Now, returning from deep-cover operations in contested space, she expected anger, demands for apology, or at minimum the cold formality of diplomatic failure. Instead, the honor guard that met her at the spaceport treated her like returning divinity. They didn't just salute, they bowed with reverence that went beyond military protocol. When Kira tried to proceed to standard debriefing, the guard captain looked genuinely confused. "Commander, the crowned sovereign awaits you in the Hall of Reunion. All other matters have been suspended for your return." "The crowned sovereign can wait until I've completed arrival protocols." "With respect, Commander, you are the arrival protocol. The sovereign has been waiting 5 years. Bureaucracy can wait a few hours more." Kira had no good response to that, so she followed the escort through streets that had changed. The architecture was familiar, but everywhere she looked there were new monuments, murals, sculptural installations. And they all depicted the same scene, her walking away from the wedding ceremony, transformed into mythological imagery. In some versions she was surrounded by stars. In others, cosmic forces pulled her toward distant horizons. In all of them, Thulmora watched her departure with an expression of serene faith. "What the hell is this?" Kira asked the guard captain. "The legend of sacred absence," they replied, as if it should be obvious. "Surely you know the story of your own trial." "My own what?" They arrived at the palace before the captain could elaborate. The Hall of Reunion had been the throne room 5 years ago, but it had been transformed into something that looked uncomfortably like a temple. The walls were covered in murals depicting Kira's departure from dozens of perspectives, each one elevated to the status of sacred art. And at the center, waiting on a throne that looked more like an altar, crowned sovereign Thulmora. They had changed. 5 years ago, Thulmora had been formal and reserved, a ruler performing duty with careful precision. Now there was an intensity in their presence, a fervent certainty that felt almost religious. Their appearance remained elegant and alien. Volcari physiology meant tall, slender forms with skin that shifted through subtle chromatic variations. But something in their bearing had transformed from diplomatic to devotional. "You have returned," Thulmora said, and their voice carried weight that made the entire court go silent. "As I knew you would, as the cosmos demanded." Kira's prepared diplomatic greetings dissolved into confusion. "I was recalled for debriefing after my mission concluded. You were called by a higher purpose 5 years ago," Thulmora interrupted gently. "And that purpose has now released you to return home. I understood this immediately when you departed. Your absence was not abandonment, it was a sacred trial." "It was a mission," Kira said, trying to inject reality into what felt like rapidly escalating delusion. "An operative was compromised in enemy territory. I was the only agent who could extract them. I had to choose between the wedding and saving a life. You had to choose between earthly ceremony and cosmic duty." Thulmora descended from the throne, approaching with movement that suggested ritual significance. "And you chose correctly. Your departure proved that our bond transcends political arrangement, that you trusted our connection enough to leave, knowing you would return when destiny allowed." The courtiers were watching with expressions of reverent attention. Several were recording this interaction, as if it were scripture being written in real time. "I don't understand what's happening," Kira said, and heard the edge of panic in her own voice. "You have lived the sacred absence," Thulmora explained, their tone suggesting they were teaching her something she should already know. "For 5 years, you have walked the path the cosmos set before you, saving lives, serving a purpose greater than ceremony, proving that true devotion exists independent of physical presence. And now you have returned, exactly as I maintained faith you would. They gestured to the murals covering the walls. Your departure became legend, Commander Kira Vance. Not abandonment, but proof of love that transcends even duty. The Alliance survived because I gave both our civilizations a story more powerful than political insult. Kira stared at them, paralysis setting in. Not from fear, but from the sheer incomprehensibility of what she was hearing. You built a cult around me, walking out on our wedding. I built a truth around our story, and I was right, you have returned. Over the following days, as Kira tried unsuccessfully to proceed with normal debriefing protocols, she learned the full scope of what Thulmora had constructed. The legend of sacred absence had become foundational to Thulkari society. Kira's departure was celebrated annually as the Day of Necessary Separation, a holiday devoted to faith that survives physical absence. There were temples where young Thulkari learned that true devotion meant trusting bonds even when circumstances forced separation. Philosophers had written treatises analyzing the cosmic significance of her choice to prioritize mission over ceremony. And the alliance, which had nearly collapsed in those first weeks after the wedding disaster, had been entirely salvaged through this narrative. Thulmora had convinced faction leaders that Kira's absence was not insult but proof of something greater. That human Thulkari unity existed on a level beyond politics. It worked, Ambassador Chen explained during a hurried private meeting. I don't know how, but Thulmora turned the worst diplomatic crisis in recent history into a religious movement that strengthened our partnership. Trade is up 40%. Military cooperation has never been stronger. They're building a joint research station. All because the crowned sovereign convinced everyone that you walking out was somehow sacred. But it wasn't, Kira said. I panicked about marrying someone I'd met 3 times and used the extraction mission as an excuse to run. I know that. You know that. But the Thulkari believe something else, and that belief has produced outcomes we could never have achieved through conventional diplomacy. Chen's expression was grim. Which brings us to your current situation. Thulmora expects you to step into the role of returned partner, the prophecy fulfilled, or whatever they're calling it. I can't do that. I can't live inside someone else's mythology about me. Then what's your alternative? Public confession that the sacred absence was you having cold feet, because that will destroy everything Thulmora built. The alliance, the cultural transformation, all of it collapses if you reveal the founding story as fiction. So I'm supposed to what? Pretend to be the cosmic lover they've been waiting for. Live a lie. I'm saying the strategic situation is delicate, and your personal crisis is unfortunately relevant to interstellar stability. Chen's voice softened. I'm sorry, Kira. But sometimes intelligence work means living inside covers you didn't choose. That night, Kira tried to explain reality to Thulmora in private. I left because I had orders. Because an operative needed extraction, and I was the only one who could do it. There was no cosmic trial, just military intelligence protocols and me not wanting to marry someone I barely knew. Thulmora listened with the patient attention of someone hearing confession, then responded, Yes, you were called by duty greater than ceremony. You prioritized saving a life over political convenience, exactly as I said. That's not, I'm saying it wasn't destiny, it was just circumstances. And what creates circumstances except the will of the cosmos working through logistics and timing? Thulmora's eyes held absolute certainty. You can call it orders or coincidence. I call it the universe ensuring you would only return when we both were ready. The interpretation is the only difference. The interpretation is everything. One version is truth and one is delusion. Is it delusion if it produces better outcomes than cynical truth? Thulmora asked quietly. The alliance survived. Our peoples have prospered. Thousands of lives have been saved through cooperation that exists because I chose to believe our bond was real. If I had accepted your departure as simple abandonment, we would have had war instead of partnership. Kira felt the ground shifting beneath her understanding. You built this mythology to save the Alliance. I built this mythology to save everything, and then I lived inside it so completely that it became indistinguishable from truth. Though Mora stepped closer, I have spent 5 years believing in our bond, building my existence around faith that you would return. And you did return. At what point does performed faith become genuine conviction? You can't just decide something is true because you believe it hard enough. That is precisely how truth works for living beings. We construct narratives and then inhabit them until the construction becomes indistinguishable from reality. You have a narrative about who you are, the independent operative, the pragmatic soldier, the person who makes hard choices. That narrative is no more objectively true than mine. It's just the story you've chosen to believe about yourself. Kira wanted to argue, but she was paralyzed again by the sheer strangeness of what Thulmora was saying. Because on some level they were right. Identity was interpretation. The person she thought she was existed only in her own head, while everyone else knew different versions built from their limited perspectives. What do you want from me? She asked finally. I want you to recognize that you have been living inside my narrative whether you chose to or not. For 5 years, you have been the sacred absence, a symbol that shaped an entire civilization. That version of you exists independent of your intentions. You cannot unmake it by confessing that you never meant to be mythological. So I'm trapped. No, you have a choice. Though Mara's voice was gentle but relentless. You can fight the interpretation others have placed on you, or you can step into it deliberately and shape what it becomes. Co-author the story instead of rejecting it entirely. And if I step into this role you've built, Kira forced herself to ask the question she'd been avoiding. You understand I don't love you. We're strangers. This was always just political arrangement. I know, Thulmora said simply. I have known this entire time. The sacred absence was about faith, not certainty. About choosing to believe in possibility rather than accepting limitation. They paused. But I have also learned that love which begins as choice sometimes becomes real through proximity and time. Live inside the mythology. See what happens when you stop fighting the story others have written and start co-authoring instead. Kira looked at them. This stranger who had spent 5 years building a religion around being abandoned, who had somehow transformed political disaster into cultural foundation, who was offering her a role in a narrative she'd never agreed to inhabit. She thought about the operative she'd saved 5 years ago, who'd gone on to prevent a massacre. She thought about the alliance that had survived because Thulmora turned humiliation into mythology. She thought about the lives saved through cooperation built on a foundation of beautiful fiction. She thought about identity and interpretation and the vertigo of realizing you only exist in the stories others tell. This is insane, she said. Perhaps, but sanity has never been particularly useful for building meaning. Thulmora extended their hand. Stay, not because you believe in the sacred absence, but because you're curious whether living inside someone else's narrative might teach you something about the person you could become. Kira stared at the offered hand for a long moment. Everything she understood about truth and identity said to refuse, to walk away, to reject the mythology and maintain the clarity of her own self-understanding. But she'd spent 5 years in deep cover, living inside false identities, being whoever the mission required. And she'd learned that sometimes the false identity taught you truths about yourself that your real identity had been hiding. She took Thulmora's hand, not because she believed in cosmic destiny or sacred trials, not because she loved this stranger who had built a religion around abandonment, but because she was curious. Curious whether meaning could exist in the gap between intention and perception, whether living inside someone else's interpretation of who you are might be a valid way to discover who you could become, whether faith that begins as political gambit can transform into something genuine through 5 years of devoted conviction. The paralysis broke. The story continued. And in the Hall of Reunion, surrounded by murals depicting her mythological departure, Kira Vance chose to become the person someone else had imagined her to be. Not because it was true, but because truth is always just the story we agree to inhabit, and sometimes the most interesting truths are the ones we never intended to live. 6 months later, tell me about the operative you saved, Volmora said one evening as they sat together reviewing diplomatic communications. It had become their routine, working side by side in companionable silence that occasionally broke into conversation. Classified, Kira replied automatically. I'm crowned sovereign of a major allied power. I have clearance. You have clearance for outcomes, not operational details. Then tell me about the outcomes. The mission you chose over our wedding, what came of it? Kira considered refusing, then realized there was no operational reason for secrecy about results. The operative I extracted had intelligence that prevented a coordinated attack on civilian population centers. Estimated casualties prevented, 40,000, maybe more. 40,000 lives saved because you chose mission over ceremony. 40,000 lives saved because I didn't want to marry a stranger and use the mission as an excuse to run, Kira corrected. Let's not mythologize it. Why not? You saved 40,000 lives. Does your motivation make those lives less valuable? No, but it makes my choice less noble than your legend suggests. Though Mora was quiet for a moment, their skin shifting through contemplative chromaticities. Can I tell you what I actually believe? Not the public mythology, but the private truth. Please. I think you made two choices that day. One was strategic, extracting an operative and preventing massacre. The other was personal, using that mission as excuse to escape a marriage you didn't want. Both things can be simultaneously true. That's not how your legend tells it. No, because legends must be simple to be powerful, but in private between us, complexity is permitted. Though Mora looked at her directly, I spent 5 years building faith around your absence. What I didn't tell anyone, what I barely admitted to myself, was that some part of me was grateful you left. Kira blinked. What? I was terrified of that wedding, of binding myself to a stranger for political necessity. When you walked away, yes, it was humiliating, but it was also relief. I didn't have to go through with something I dreaded. Though Mora's voice was very quiet, so I built the sacred absence as political salvation, certainly, but also as emotional protection. If your leaving was cosmic trial rather than rejection, I could preserve my dignity while avoiding a marriage I didn't truly want. Then why spend 5 years believing I would return? Because the alternative was accepting that I was alone by choice, and that felt more frightening than being alone by fate. If you were out there undergoing cosmic trial, I could be patient. But if you were simply gone by preference, I had to confront my own isolation. They sat with this admission hanging between them. Finally, Kira said, so we both used mythology to avoid truth. Yes. You used mission protocols to escape unwanted marriage. I used sacred narrative to reframe abandonment. We're both people who hide inside stories when reality becomes uncomfortable. That's a depressing foundation for a partnership. Or it's an honest one. Though Mora managed something like a smile. Most relationships begin with myths about love at first sight or destined partnership. We began with myths about sacred separation and cosmic trials. At least we're both aware our foundation is constructed. And now, 6 months of living inside your mythology, has it become real? Some of it, I have genuine fondness for you that wasn't present before. Affection built through proximity and shared work. Whether that qualifies as love by any objective standard, I don't know, but it's more than we had. Same, Kira admitted. You're less of a stranger, more of a I don't know. Person I'm choosing to know, instead of person I'm obligated to tolerate. Perhaps that's all partnership actually is. Choosing to continue knowing someone despite having the option to leave. They returned to reviewing diplomatic communications, but something had shifted. a small dissolution of performed mythology into acknowledged complexity. They weren't the sacred absence and faithful sovereign anymore, just two people who'd use stories to escape uncomfortable truths, now tentatively exploring whether honesty might produce something more interesting than legend. The mythology still existed. The temples still stood. The day of necessary separation would be celebrated in 4 months, and both of them would participate in ceremonies honoring a narrative they'd privately acknowledged as constructed fiction. But in their private moments, they were learning to live in the space between the person you think you are and the person others believe you to be. And discovering that maybe the most profound truth is that identity is always performed, relationships are always interpreted, and meaning exists only because we agree to see it. Whether we call that agreement love, faith, or simply the courage to inhabit stories we didn't originally choose. The paralysis of return had dissolved into something more sustainable, the ordinary work of building partnership from mythology, one honest conversation at a time, while maintaining the beautiful fiction that kept civilizations aligned and alliances strong. It wasn't the story